Prize winner James Risen writes in The Intercept, pointing out a stark truth about the man currently occupying the Oval Office. Quote, 1 year after Trump took office, it is still unclear whether the President of the United States is an agent of foreign power. Jim Risen joins me now, and it's a real pleasure to have you here. You have been covering intelligence for literally decades. You've co-written a book with someone who worked at the CIA, specifically about the KGB. Taking that, because you write about this in the piece, just start there with your knowledge of how the KGB and its successor agencies operated and how that looks, the indictment today, and what we know about Russian interference with that history and context.
Sure. I think the Russian interference in the 2016 election fits perfectly into the past history of the way the KGB has operated over the years. They are experts at covert action programs that are designed to inject disinformation into foreign countries. And one of the Cold War cases that I talk about in the piece is called Operation Infection in the early 1980s, where the KGB went to great lengths through cutouts and intermediaries and using, unwitting news organizations to spread the rumor and the false story that the United States was behind the HIV/AIDS virus. And that had an insidious effect in the third world for a long time. It was kind of the precursor to fake news.
Yeah, the documentation of that in the piece, and then it sort of led me down a rabbit hole looking at, doctors who off and letters written into news publications and publications running stories on these supposed connections all across the world, all of it a KGB operation to spread this very damaging misinformation.
Yeah, and I think one of the most interesting things was that there were East German scientists involved in spreading this rumor at a time when Vladimir Putin was a KGB officer in East Germany. And so it's very likely he knew about Operation Infection, and he then later, as you know, became director of the FSB in 1998, even before he became president of Russia. So he has a long tradition steeped into the KGB's history of covert action.
When you read the indictment, what are your takeaways, given all the reporting you've done on intelligence agencies for the years?
Well, one of the things that is not, I think I've kind of focused on what was not said in the indictment, which was how did Mueller get this information?
Right.
And to me, that was the most interesting thing, because up until now, I've been concerned about whether or not Mueller will have the full cooperation of the U.S. intelligence community to gather information inside Russia, which he'll need to prove certain parts of his case. And that, to me, showed that he does have information coming out of Russia in a way that's pretty impressive, and that more than I had really anticipated. And it raises, to me, it's an interesting question. Which agencies are cooperating with Mueller despite Trump's attempts to politicize this?
Well, Frank Figliuzzi, who worked with Mueller on counterintelligence, was talking about this at the top of the show, that one of the reads he had from the document was the collaboration that Mueller's getting. And that kind of collaboration is not a given, even when you don't have the incredibly dysfunctional situation, right? Having reported on the unbelievably fierce rivalries, sometimes outright contempt between these various entities,
right?
This is somewhat unusual.
Yeah, and especially now, it's very fraught because you've got Mike Pompeo, who's the CIA director, who's very close to Trump and is seen as a Trump loyalist. And so there's a lot of questions about how aggressively is the intelligence community going to be in supporting Mueller. And I thought that was the most interesting part of this, is it looks like he's getting information out of Russia.
Do you think, take me through your thinking about the underlying operation here and when you became convinced of its size and scope?
Well, I think in the piece I wrote, which came out right before this indictment, I wanted to step back and look, and I was kind of stunned by how much information is already available to show that pretty conclusively that the Russians were behind the intervention in the 2016 election. And even before the indictment today, I thought one of the most remarkable stories that came out recently that has gotten very little attention in the United States was published in the Dutch press a few weeks ago about how Dutch intelligence had real-time real-time access to what the Russian hackers were doing, and they were passing that on to the NSA in real time. And the story, which has been mentioned in the United States but hasn't gotten much attention, shows that they actually took control of the security cameras inside the Russian offices where they were doing the hack, and were able to match faces of the people in the hack, in that room where they were doing the hack, against Russian intelligence officers. And so that's the kind of level of detail that we now believe the United States has because of liaison with European intelligence and other things. And one of the other stories that came out recently that hasn't gotten much attention is a spy case in Moscow, where a hacker who had been arrested has come out and said that he was involved in the hack of the DNC on behalf of the Russian intelligence, and he named an FSB officer who separately has already been arrested for spying for the United States by the Russians. And so the evidence is just piling up almost on a daily basis that shows that Russia was behind the intervention in the election.
Let me ask you about the headline and the sort of piece the question you posed me. Is Donald Trump a traitor? And it's obviously an incredibly provocative question. You write in it that people dismiss it because it seems almost hyperbolic or too much to contemplate. Why is that to you the core question?
Because that's what all of this is saying is, was Donald Trump elected with the help of Russia? Did he cooperate with a foreign government to take control of the United States government? That, to me, is almost a textbook definition of treason. And if he did that, if collusion is proven, then I think almost by definition he's a traitor. And I think everyone is afraid of the consequences of using that word because it's so fraught. But that is essentially what it is. If you collude with an adversary of the United States to take over the government of the United States, you're a traitor.
What do you think? You use the word collude, and collusion is this term that obviously the president constantly says no collusion, which is, you know, that and $3 gets you on the subway. But what do you think collusion would look like were it to be found? Like, what are you looking for as someone who's immersed in this world?
Well, that's what I'm trying to do. This first piece, I only looked at whether the Russians were involved in the meddling. The next piece I'm doing is about did Trump collude? And I think that's, to me, the question the evidence we have on collusion is not as strong as the evidence we have on Russian meddling. And I think the way I think about it right now is we have very strong evidence on Russian meddling, pretty strong evidence of Trump's attempts at obstruction of justice to try to block the Mueller investigation, and less conclusive evidence about Trump's collusion with Moscow.
Yeah, that linchpin is the opening.
That's kind of the hole in the donut at this point. And I think that, but it strikes me that if, you know, there are plenty of contacts, there's lots of anecdotal evidence, and it looks like that's kind of the place that Mueller's investigation is beginning to converge on.
Jim Risen, thanks for joining me. That is all in for the hour. Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening, Chris. Thanks, my friend. Much appreciated. Thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. So I think the biggest thing that we learned today is that this guy has quite a lot of rabbits stuffed into that hat.